Um, Welcome everybody to this, the last session of the very strange fall semester of the history of material texts. We're all looking forward to your coming back in the spring when we'll have another strange semester, and we're all looking forward to a day when we will all be together. Although, of course, the upside of our distance seminars is that we're able to welcome so many of you from so far away, which is terrific. I'm Jerry Singerman. I'm the Senior Humanities Editor at the University of Pennsylvania Press and one of the co-conveners of this workshop, along with Zachary Lesser, who's Professor of English at Penn.
Hi, everyone.
Okay. And John Pollack, the Curator of Research Services at the Kislak Center.
Hi, friends.
And of course, we are held together by the competence of Philip Mogan, our Bristol Schoenberg Fellow, who
Hi, everyone.
sends out all the emails and gets all of the Zoom working. And of course, we wouldn't be here without our founding father, Peter Stollybrass, who more years ago than we can really remember started this workshop and has been going every week ever since. So the amazing thing is the workshop has gotten older, but Peter has not. And it's a pleasure to see you, Peter. So,
hi, everybody.
Okay. And it is a great pleasure to welcome this evening Priya Joshi. Priya arrived in Philadelphia in 2005 from Berkeley, where she had been an associate professor of English. She came in 2005 to Temple, where she is professor of English. She's also this year, or last year, I guess, the director of the Margins and Minorities lecture series, sponsored by the Global Studies Program. Priya is a historian of the book and a historian and theorist of the novel, a student of cinema and especially Bollywood cinema, the sociology of culture, and post-colonial modernities. And she focuses on the 19th through the 21st centuries. She is a past chair of the MLA Executive Committee of the Division of 20th and 21st century English literature. And she's also served on the board of directors of SHARP, the Society for the History of Authorship, Reading, and Publishing. She's the author of two books. The first, In Another Country, Colonialism, Culture, and the English Novel in India, was published by Columbia in 2002 and Oxford in 2003. Was that Oxford, India, or yeah, so Oxford, India in 2003. And that book won the MLA Prize for the Best First Book and also the Sonia Rudikoff Prize for the Best First Book in Victorian Studies. Her second book was Bollywood's India, A Public Fantasy, published by Columbia in 2015. And in between, she was also the co-editor of the 1970s and its legacies in India's cinemas. So we're delighted to welcome Priya. Her current project is a book rethinking the theory of the novel based on contemporary popular fictions produced outside the metropolis. And I think that's what she was originally going to present on, and then different inspiration struck. And we are delighted and quite interested to hear Priya present on Decolonizing Archives. Before we start, one slight break from our newly established traditions is Priya has asked that the chat be dismantled during her talk so as not to distract those of us like myself who are really wretched multitaskers. And of course, the chat function will be turned back on once we move into the Q&A period. Priya, welcome, and very much looking forward to this.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you all at Material Text. Thank you, Peter, for starting this thing 27 years ago. Jerry mentioned that I moved to Philly in 2005, and I have to say it was really like being warmly folded into the arms of a family that I hadn't imagined. And seeing so many of you on screen with your cameras on is again being reminded that the book history family is huge, and it's across disciplines, it's across histories and geographies. And I think a huge amount of the tribute for all of this welcome really goes to all of you, Peter for starting this, and then Zach, Jerry, Phil, and John for just keeping it going. You guys have been incredibly, incredibly welcoming to me personally, but to all of the scholars who are sitting in this room. And I know we're not supposed to say thank you to very much these days. It's such a gloomy time, but I do think that we should say thank you to Zoom. It's highly unlikely I'd be seeing so many of you who are scattered across the country if it weren't for Zoom. So I guess, yeah, thank you, Zoom. I should also mention that this paper is literally very, very new. In the sense that, it was written in a moment of what I can only describe now as cold rage. And it's a rage that's been brewing since the summer, since May 29, since, the killing of George Floyd and all of the protests that have ensued. And I just felt that I had to write about it. And this seemed like a place to try those ideas out. And I'm hoping that I've talked about material text as a family, but you'll do what families do. You'll sort of accept this paper and engage it with the kind of, what does my family do? With the kind of frank and direct, comments on it, because it really is very, very fresh and very new. So let's begin. And Zach has put out on the chat, and maybe when we, at the end of the talk, we'll put it out one more time. It's a list of the names I'm mentioning, a brief, it's just short titles of figures that I'll be talking about in case the spellings or references are helpful. Okay, the topic of this paper is decolonizing archives. The term archive includes two meanings. The first designates a place for storage and accumulation, so national archives. Second, the term also designates the contents of that place. So we might say George Washington's papers at the National Archives. Neither the place nor its content is neutral, nor was it ever intended to be. The term archive fetishizes content that was deemed worthy of preservation today, Today, the understanding of archival content to imply public documents or important historical documents, according to the OED, has been exposed for its narrowness. I realize, by the way, that I forgot to share a screen, so why don't I do that right now? You would think that we know what we're doing with Zoom, but we often forget. And for those of you who haven't fiddled around with your Zoom, at the very top right, there's a feature where you can have speaker side-by-side view. That way you'll only see the slides and my face. You won't be distracted. Okay, so the understanding of archival content to imply public documents or historical documents, which is what the OED calls an archive, has been exposed by book historians for its narrowness. Today, those of us who are in this conversation and book historians around have productively expanded what constitutes public and historical. Today, private documents such as identity cards, juvenilia, ephemera, sketchbooks, ledgers, as well as items circulating in some kind of public, such as sermons, letters, postcards, poems, publishing records, also constitutes archives. And here we have two people in the room whose work has been incredibly influential. I'm thinking of Derek Spires, whose work on sort of multiple archives, including church archives and early print culture, 19th century print culture, in African-American communities has been very significant. And then Kinohi Nishikawa's 2018 book, Street Players, which looked at the publishing archive of one sort of minor publisher in LA, has really opened up the sense of what constitutes public and archive. And there are others, but these come to mind because they're so fresh. So up to this point, up to 2020, I'd spent the better part of my scholarly life creatively ransacking archives in order to uncover stories that I thought were hidden in plain sight. Mine has been a bespoke and one-off practice. Each research question involved a quick scoop for archival takeout. The present moment, however, calls for something different if we are to gather resources from the past to imagine a different future. But how does one read the past? How does one use archives responsively when one had no hand in their creation? when one does not share the ideologies of power and prestige that were key in creating them? What insights might postcolonial studies offer for decolonizing archives whose quote unquote colonial origins have been rewritten, not by decolonization, but by genocide? So what I mean by that is that for somebody like myself who worked mostly in 18th and 19th century British archives of the British Empire, it was very clear that once independence happened in 1947, suddenly this notion was that those archives of colonialism were rewritten and India became a player, an actor, an agent in its own story. And this process has repeated. So the archives weren't by the British, they became of the British. But the other part of it is, of course, when you have a history of settling or history of colonialism, which doesn't end in decolonization, those archives then seem to be dispersed and sometimes even erased. And it's those second kinds of archives that I'm interested in talking about. So the archives that I just called not neutral are deeply embedded in the ideologies of power of their time. There is no document of civilization, wrote Walter Benjamin. There's no document of civilization that is not at the same time a document of barbarism. And, continued Benjamin, just as such a document is not free of barbarism, barbarism taints also the manner in which it was transmitted from one owner to the other. Now, this essay is probably quite well known for many people. It's from the Thesis of Philosophy of History, but Benjamin was commenting around the acquisition of what he called cultural treasures that followed the victors in battle. Now, the comments seem particularly apposite to the archives of the British Empire in India. These are the archives that I'm most familiar with and that formed the basis of my first book almost 20 years ago. Decolonizing those archives, archives that included documents by the British, as well as those on or despite the British, involved what I call a bifocal interpretive practice. It meant learning to read familiar objects differently. So this is what you might call critique. So this would mean that this would mean that in that archive, I would look at the British novel, which is often thought of as this fantastic document of Anglicization, and I would read it differently. I wouldn't read it as a 19th century British colonialist like Macaulay, let's say, but I would read it as, but potentially a 19th century Indian reader might. But working with this archive also involved locating different objects for study. So this I called counter discourse. And in this specific case, which is something that I tracked in another country, the goal then was to look at what Indian readers were doing with this material, how this novel, this object of colonization, circulated in India, how long it circulated, how it was refuted or rejected. So it was a whole different object and involved looking at library records or publishing statistics and so on. So this is what I call the kind of bifocal interpretive practice, critique on the one hand, counter discourse on the other. The global BLM protests of this past summer shine a new light on the barbarism of archives and the civilizing mission of protest. As statues, murals, and flags are taken down and painted over in Bristol, in Oxford, in Philadelphia, and in Mississippi, we are relearning the work that lies ahead of us for decolonizing archives. And these images are widely circulated. They're all from sort of mainstream press. The left image of Edward Colston being toppled in Bristol, Edward Colston, the slave trader. The middle image is of Frank Rizzo's statue being papered over in South Philly. And then the bottom two images are the new flag of Mississippi, which takes away the Confederate image on the top left of the flag. So the scale and range of these protests in this historical moment urge a new reckoning about archives, tout court. Archives exist as chronotopes. They are zones where time and space encounter each other. What we see in an archive depends on where we stand. So thus, whether we're standing in the center, quote unquote, or the periphery. When we stand, and in this context, you might imagine standing in Oriel College, Oxford in 1881 when Cecil Rhodes graduated, or you might be standing in Oriel College in 1911 when Cecil Rhodes gave Oriel the funding to secure its future. Or we might be standing in Oriel College in 2020 when the college voted to remove the statue. So what we see in an archive then depends on where we stand, when we stand, but it also depends in large part on how we stand. And here, this is what I'm going to be focusing on the most. How we stand when contemplating archives fundamentally engages the concept of sociology. It's a scrutiny of what the book historian D.F. Mackenzie called the human motives and interactions which texts involve in every stage of their production, transmission, and circulation. It's a famous quote of Mackenzie's. It became his Beinecke lectures from 1984, but he's particularly interested in the notion that the texts circulate, and with it, the history of the institutions where that text is embedded circulates as well. And all of this affects what he calls the forms of social discourse, past and present. And this is what I'd like us to look at. Archives are not just what a group remembers, I'm going to propose, but also how it remembers. They are also a place that marks what a community forgets. Thus, a statue commemorating a civilizing event, the so-called discovery of a continent, for example, is also forgetting the genocide that followed and the version of apartheid that still continues in the so-called New World. Here I'm referencing the statue of Columbus on Marconi Plaza, whose cover-up exposes one of Philadelphia's ugliest selves, but it's an ugliness we see in many, many other cities among other communities whose fragile sense of belonging to what Isabel Wilkerson calls the dominant caste can only be affirmed by ignoring the barbarism that enabled it. So for those of you who are making your holiday reading to Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, it's in the origins of our discontents, the basic point of Wilkerson's book is that sort of the way to understand race is to align it with a caste infrastructure. And for this, she turns to India's 2,000-year-old caste system and aligns it with the caste system that she notes occurring in the Third Reich in Germany. And the argument then is that race is something is a distraction, that the real economy of caste is what's at stake here. This kind of work, and so for Wilkerson then, the caste economy places lots and lots of quote unquote white people at the bottom. It's just that at some point, those white populations, the Italians in this image, the Irish in Wilkerson's argument, align themselves with the dominant caste and then keep pushing the lower caste even below. And Wilkerson insists on using the word caste rather than race or racism. This is work, by the way, that also finds a very wonderful echo with Raylan Barnes' work on blackface, which on blackface plays, dramas that she said are embedded in what she calls the Americanization pedagogy. So these then are the archives that I'm interested in. And the question I pose is, how do we decolonize archives such as these? So for this part of my talk, I turned to the interpretive resources of narratology in which I was trained, which is to pose the questions where, when, and how to read an archive. Questions that are crucial to exposing the civilization and barbarism embedded in the cultural spoils of conquest. So I'm going to turn to a few pages from an album of sketches made by a Kiowa leader who turned artist, a man named Etahdleuh Doanmoe, recording a series of incidents that took place during Doanmoe's imprisonment in Oklahoma in 1875, and his forced removal under US Army Guard to Fort Marion in St. Augustine, Florida. And this is the journey that Doanmoe endured. The album is from a collection held at the Beinecke Library at Yale, and a few pages from it were recently displayed at a Yale student-curated exhibit called Places, Nations, Generations, Being 200 Years of Indigenous North American Art at the Yale Art Museum, which is where I saw it in January of this year when I gave a talk at Yale. And then I went back to see it again actually on Leap Day on February 29th. And I thought, oh, this is it, I'm gonna come back. And of course, lockdown happened, and I'm hoping I can make it back to actually handle it myself. So I'll eventually get to Yale itself, but first let's look at the page from the album on display, which is entitled Indian Prisoners Arriving at Caddo I.T, May 5th, 1875. I.T stands for Indian Territory. So Beinecke's descriptive bibliography to the image lists Etahdleuh Doanmoe and lists the creator as Etahdleuh Doanmoe and the other creator as Richard Henry Pratt. The drawing is hand-colored in pencil and it's very small. It's roughly 8.5 by 11 inches, keeping with the size of an album page. And it's in fact part of a bound ledger and is today known as ledger art. And there's lots of empty space, as you'll see through much of it. Almost half of the image is empty, it's unpainted or undrawn. What's striking at first view is how close one has to get to see anything. And when one gets close, it's really difficult to see any prisoners that were noted in the caption. What one sees instead are icons of settler colonialism: guns, houses, carriages, horses. The only people in the drawing seem to be the soldiers. The prisoners, however, do exist, but they're largely as inscribed absences, inside the carriages, virtually hidden from view and from history. It's the alphabetic caption that does the work of locating the prisoners. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, this one seems to need 9 more words to be legible. Indian prisoners arriving at Caddo I.T, May 5, 1875. And so this is a close-up thanks to the awesome digitization of the Beinecke collection. So the invitation that there's more than meets the eye appears in Beinecke's bibliographic metadata, noting Richard Henry Pratt as the other creator. Pratt, it turns out, is as much a creator of the picture as the influenza epidemic of 1918 co-created the Egon scale print. Pratt was a US Army captain. He was later promoted to brigadier general as a way to push him out, and we'll get to that in just a second. But in this image, at the time of this image, he was a US Army captain who had prisoners under his watch make the drawings. He then sold the drawings on the tourist market and pocketed the proceeds. The album from which this collection is drawn, however, is a compilation that Pratt made for his son Mason. Pratt himself provided the captions, which are what you see, which are the holographic image that you see. And they are part explanation, part boast of his work as captor in the unsettling march of prisoners whose crime was being native to land that Pratt was commissioned to clear. Pratt's commerce from the settlement and genocide goes further. On stops during the train ride, remember that image of the train ride from Caddo, from Oklahoma down to Florida. On stops during the train ride from Oklahoma to Fort Marion, Florida, Pratt would ask the prisoners to disembark, and he would display them as tourist attractions and charge for the spectacle. His was a form of triple commerce. Native land was forcibly taken, native bodies were put on display, and native art was quote Americanized and sold for profit, his profit. Eventually, Pratt won acclaim for his work in founding and running the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, to which thousands of Native American youth were sent to quote unquote assimilate around Pratt's belief, and I'm quoting, to kill the Indian and save the man. Interestingly enough, that the Carlisle Indian Industrial School is no longer in operation. It is now the site of the US War College. So images and albums such as these circulated as gifts, as Pratt's was for his son Mason. They were dispersed and purchased for single exemplary pages, and they were sometimes reconstituted as account books among those who received them. They were also acquired by archives such as the Beinecke, sometimes as single pages and other times as a whole. So this is just a piece of text from the Beinecke's data on a different collection by Doanmoe and another artist named Kiowa. And we have then the history. The ledger belonged to so-and-so Valdez, probably a butcher in Florida, listing his clients, his business entries, and computations about the students. So that actual material object is many stories of commerce. And I don't want to make too much about the butchery, but yeah, it has, you know, this irony of the butcher owning it, and then also these images that found their way in these ledgers. Beinecke's bibliographic data on this particular drawing invites a different way of viewing it. With Pratt listed as other creator, it exposes the history of capture, dispossession, and repossession in the making of an image. Doanmoe's refusal to provide the faces and figures of Pratt's prisoners is in contrast to the radiant images that, with their full faces and glorious figures, that Doanmoe made of young Kiowans dressed for a ceremonial visit. This is an image from another drawing that's held at the Beinecke, and this time, as you can see, the caption is typed rather than handwritten. So Doanmoe then is, and I couldn't think of a better adjective, but a mysterious or unwitting, let's call it, captive ambassador, recording a cultural genocide and anticipating its arc. In the image he draws of the prisoners arriving at Caddo, the Indians, quote unquote, are already absorbed into the totems of settler violence. They are in the car, deracinated, adrift from their people and their land. The car marks both their invisibility and their refusal. It underscores the extraordinary journey from Kiowa land in Oklahoma to St. Augustine, Florida, and eventually to Carlisle, Pennsylvania. The minute drawing stands as a rebuke to the scale of settler violence that was inaudible to the practitioner, but remains loud and clear to later viewers. Let me offer then a few conclusions about decolonizing archives from this one drawing. What we see in archives depends on where we stand, when we stand, and how we stand. Even when we cannot decide what's in an archive, we can decide how it's to be read and used. And if our interpretive resources need help, the collections speak to us. It's a slow and difficult process to hear voices buried across a century or more. Catherine McCleary and Leah Shastinian, the 21st century curators of the current Yale exhibit, write that the objects they collected for the show that I've mentioned, which by the way is still open except the Yale Art Museum is closed, but it would have been on display till late in February 2021. So these two curators note that the objects that they collected for the show speak to the entangled, often violent, yet ever-changing relationship between their current steward, Yale, and the indigenous nations to which they belong. As captives, ambassadors, and ancestors, these objects are never silent, unquote. So Yale and its collections are bursting with skeletons of colonial atrocities, starting with the naming of Yale College in 1718, with wealth acquired in India by the 17th century merchant, potentially slave trader. There's a lot of debate about this, Elihu Yale. The institution's archives, however, stand out as a speech act. Their material and digital objects convey a double impulse, that of collectors, but also that of the many presents in which these collections are retrieved and viewed. Beinecke's bibliographic metadata invites 21st century users to inquire about the gaps in the object of study and to pursue a fuller reckoning with the history that they mark, or a history that they ignore. If we want, we can learn more about Doanmoe, that he was the son of a Kiowa father and a Mexican mother, that he was 19 years old in 1875 when he was captured for resisting the Kiowa resettlement from the lower plains, that the paper art he practiced was because the buffalo on whose hides plains artists had historically recorded their stories had been rendered near extinction. So the paper ledgers then were a substitute, both in scale, I mean, they're 8.5 by 11 as opposed to the buffalo hides, which are much, much larger, but also in texture. When you draw on buffalo hide, you can't use a pencil or a color pencil. It's often dyes. Pencils have a different relationship to paper than dye to hide. So the history that Doanmoe ends up recording then in the ledger art is new, but it's also a shrunken history. Doanmoe was retrained in perspective by Pratt and encouraged to draw. After his imprisonment in Fort Marion, Florida, where he served as quartermaster to Richard Henry Pratt, he attended the Carlisle Industrial School, and this is a student card from the school. He attended the school for 3 years and left. For a few months, Doanmoe worked in the Bureau of Ethnology at the Smithsonian. He married a woman named Laura Etahdleuh, and we see her name up here. And he had a son whom they named, and you really can't make this up, whom they named Richard, presumably after Pratt. Doanmoe became a Presbyterian missionary, and he died shortly after at the age of 32 of tuberculosis. Richard Pratt, interestingly, on the other hand, died, a man who was 16 years older than Doanmoe, died at the age of 84. Doanmoe's 2,000 plus mile travels of dispossession and deracination record Pratt's dictum to kill the Indian. They equally record that no man was ever saved in Pratt's practice, kill the Indian, save the man. So decolonizing archives then is a collective act. It's an act of faith and of painstaking patience. It is above all an encounter between time and space. The work of decolonization is a bit like viewing Doanmoe's drawing of prisoners arriving at Caddo. One has to peer closely at the object and its absences and take an interpretive cue from them. Decolonizing archives is about where one stands, when one stands, and how one stands. It's also about recognizing how different archives are organized and how they yield to multiple encounters or to what Saidiya Hartman calls forms of trespassing. Decolonizing archives is a matter of opening a conversation for a different future. As the Beinecke reminds us in the headnote to its digital collections, libraries exist to help readers understand and confront history, to inform the present in service of the future. Decolonizing is a practice both of reading and writing, and in decolonizing the archive, one is, in a sense, fabricating a new one. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Priya. That was wonderful and provocative and distressing and extraordinarily thought-provoking. The floor is now open for questions, and the chat screen should probably be open again for chattering. And so, looking for questions. While waiting for the questions, I just have a question, observation, or interested in your thoughts about the Doanmoe image, which is that the Indian prisoners are, as you say, all but invisible, but the scale of the wagons in which they're being brought is identical in scale and shape to all of the houses built by the Americans, and until you look closely, the heads of the Indians themselves really echoed the windows in the houses. And so those carriages and the environment built by the Americans are kind of oddly equated to one another. Both of them, of course, smaller than the marching soldiers. So I don't know what to make of that, but I'm wondering what you do.
Thanks, Jerry. Should I leave this image on, people, or should I take it down? I can do whichever, and I can certainly go back and forth fairly quickly, but I'm glad you picked up on that. You know, I noticed the same thing, Jerry, and it took me actually a lot of time to realize that there were actually Indians in this image. So the first version of this paper, when I was drafting it, thought, oh, right, they're inscribed absences. You only know this because the caption's doing the work. And then, of course, Beinecke has this amazing digital sort of scan where you can go in, and Mitch has just posted it on the chat. And that's when I realized that there was this other stuff happening. The faces were the size of windows. I'm going to have to actually go back and now this time handle it. I'm not sure. John mentioned just before we started that there is quite a lot of work on ledger art, and I'm curious, you know, what people do with this, how they read it, and how close they get, and if they in fact get close. So again, for those who are scholars of art history, there's this whole other tradition, and I don't want to push it because I don't think there's necessarily a connection, but there was a strong tradition of miniature art in South Asia that then gets anglicized by the colonials, and a new style of South Asian miniature art is born called company style, where you take this miniature art that the Mughals had perfected in the courts, and then they bring it out for company, sort of East India Company circulation. It's not clear if that practice is taking place here of miniaturizing and that people actually knew how to look at this. But this is fascinating because I've actually seen the heights which hang at Plains museums, and they're massive. But anyway, yeah, this is exactly right. There's a sense of distortion, right? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Sonia Drimmer.
Hi, I take it you can hear me, yeah?
We hear you.
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for a really, really powerful talk. I see my hand is still up, so I'm gonna unraise my hand. Oh no, I can't do it. In any case, my question is going to reveal that I may have had a lapse in listening comprehension. So with that said, do we know who wrote the pencil caption and to the image? And whether you mentioned it or not, have you imagined how that caption might be rewritten if inscribed in a manner that attempts an effort at decolonization through speaking that assumes another perspective at its center? And I say that because, having followed the link, the caption on the image is the caption on the Beinecke website as well.
Right. So this handwritten caption is in Pratt's hand, and there are a few others of them out there. So we know what Pratt's hand is, and there's a lot that Pratt wrote when he was sort of at the Carlisle Industrial School. So that's the first answer. How would it look like for somebody else to write the caption? I don't know, but maybe it doesn't need to be written, right? I mean, writing takes many forms, and it's exactly the caption and its kind of clinical simplicity that invites us to think about a different history, right? And the curators did an amazing job in the kind of text that accompanies this image. And in fact, that's really what got to me the first time I saw this in January, was how chilling this, you know, this spectacular commerce, or this commerce of spectacle was, that Pratt, there was nothing wrong that he would just have these prisoners trot out and do a dance or whatever, and he would make money, and then he would pop them back in and he would take them away. And I think it's this recovery that is more interesting than rewriting the caption, because if the caption were more neutral, maybe we wouldn't be invited to do the work that I'm urging we need to do.
Oh, I think I was suggesting more that it would be, it seems, you said there's like a clinicalness, it's sterile, and just in an effort at kind of, fabulation or something, imagining what it might be like if it were even less clinical, but yeah.
Laura Etahdleuh.
Hi, thank you so much for this paper. It's a lot of food for thought. And I mean, I'm following up, I guess, a little on that question, and that I was wondering if you knew, are there other people who have prisoners drawing pictures like this? Was this something lots of, people guarding them were doing, or was he kind of a one-off and profiting off of his prisoners in this way? And also along those lines, because if there were others, it might be easier to answer this question, but I was just wondering to what extent they're truly co-creators, and then I'm thinking about, whether Pratt is really like coaching them, this is how you should draw this picture, I want the soldiers looking like this, or if this is coming from Doanmoe himself. I mean, I just wondered if you have any way of answering that question, like, was this, is this a style of art? I mean, I'm thinking of like Asian art often has a style that's very much about the background and the scenery. I don't know a lot about his Kiowa, his tribe. I mean, whether that's a type, this idea of the little tiny people in the big scene as a type of art he would be familiar with, or if this is something a Western person is imposing on him. So I just wondered if you had more thoughts of that, or directions you might go if you don't know.
So Catherine James raised her hand as soon as this question was asked, and I haven't met you, Catherine James, but I'm so happy to meet you now. Could you please, did you have an answer to that? Because this is, of course, an archive you're familiar with.
Oh, well, I was wondering about, on this line of thought, but basically wondering about if Priya, if you were thinking of engaging with the often invisible history of the metadata creators, the database fields that are this sort of very living, as you point out, this living mediation between us observing records and an institutional archive, and then the sort of very nuanced history of how those descriptions have ended up being formed. And I was so curious, because of course this isn't in my collections, but those captions in the digital library record that you're pulling from are referring to a list that's in the archival finding aid that I'm sure came at a point of sale and might have been framed by the bookseller or auction house that was pulling these descriptions together. And again, this clinical aspect of it is something that I find really interesting, because it calls on this history of imperial description. But it also, your talk is, I found really fascinating that it highlights the weight that we put on these descriptions, which in my own experience are often kind of hastily derived from the information that is to hand by an agent somewhere in an auction house, whoever, who is trying to draw these objects or papers into some form of market coherence. And so the only way we access these archives is through metadata. And yet the metadata is a sort of almost patriarchal stand-in, like there's a way in it acts as an authority that people chafe against, that respond to. I'm not necessarily sure that it, I'm curious about the weight that we should put on this like godlike authority of metadata, because it's often, I think, quite casual. And the reason I thought of that in your talk particularly is that I know that internally the history of that database, right? And what you're looking at, the other creator, is just a database field where an institution was trying to create an apparatus to absorb records. It's not creator in a kind of Adamic sense, right? And so that's something that I think is really fascinating, right? Like, how do we engage with at what point is anyone responsible for the colonial, like the fact that these archives are an exertion of power? And so, you know, I could sit here and pass the buck essentially and say, well, they were just creating a database, and yet it is important, isn't it? And I think that comes back to this like clinical aspect of it. And I guess that's the question I would ask you is, like, who do you think is, like, if we're talking about decolonizing the archive, how would you approach that? I mean, would you rewrite the metadata, or just practically, like, what practical approach would you take to that?
Okay, this is really helpful. I should make clear, I mean, there are different kinds of quote unquote data that one can look at, right? To me, the Beinecke data is extremely helpful. And I take your point, Catherine, that these are ways of creating linkages. So, you know, other creator may have been a clumsy, efficient way of getting something done. But it's helpful, right? There's enough in that story that we didn't need that other creator. Other creator just becomes one more example in which this figure has been quote unquote absorbed, right? Is it, right? I mean, the absorption of this Kiowa artist, this Kiowa individual into this history is remarkable, but there's so many traces of another history. And I actually think that Beinecke has done an awesome job, because along with that brief other creator, which is what I focused on and I sort of highlighted in the presentation, there's an extraordinary biography. In fact, it's an awesome biography of who Doanmoe was, you know, when he was born. And that's where I found out that he'd also worked at the Smithsonian, which is another archive that led me to. So actually, I think that this material is actually very responsibly presented. Now, what I couldn't tell is when the Beinecke acquired this specific drawing. What I can tell is that there's some material that was acquired in 2009. And again, the descriptive bibliography is quite helpful. The metadata is just one inkling of, you know, these are a chunk of skeletons and we need to poke around and see what bodies they build into, right? So I think that it's helpful what you propose, but it's also part of the project. So the other question is, how do you decolonize the archive? I'm not proposing that we do away with the archive, that we burn the Beinecke, quite from it, right? Just before the talk began, we were all, at least I was saying how much I'd like to have my ashes scattered over there. What I'm proposing is that these archives have histories that are worth uncovering. And for some periods, those histories are richer than for others. And this is one of the reasons I brought up Saidiya Hartman at the very end. I mean, Hartman writes in Venus in Two Acts and in her recent book how little she has to work with. And this is why she presents this critical approach this approach that she calls critical fabulation. I don't think there's that much fabulation one needs to do for some archives. And I think this moment and this history is right there. It's what I call hidden in plain view, which is exactly what happened with the 19th century archives I was looking at in India. So then it's not a matter of critical fabulation, it's a matter of critical viewing. We look at these things and we are inspired to find a different history, right? So that's, I hope that addresses what you were asking.
Okay, the Q&A is stacking up now. There's also
Jerry, can I just
in the chat? Yes.
throw one thing in quickly, because I think if I'm reading the record right, the drawing and the collection that it's part of, Richard Henry Pratt Papers, gift of Margaret Hawkins Seeley, Edward Hawkins Jr., and Richard Pratt Hawkins, 1959 and 1976. So it looks like that drawing came as part of a set of Pratt Papers quite a few decades ago.
And John, I'm glad you brought that up. The Pratt papers are massive. By the way, I hope you all noticed there's no image of Pratt in this talk, even though there are tons of images of Pratt if you look on, just Google him. Pratt, there are 109 boxes or something like that of Pratt papers at the Beinecke. There's 9 or 12 pictures of Doanmoe, and that's what I wanted to focus on. If you just look at a different history, maybe we can uncover a story that needs to be reckoned with. And that's the project I'm trying to do. That's what I mean by decolonizing, not burning the archive, but looking at a different archive right behind the one that we're used to looking at.
Okay, on to more questions. There seem to be a couple of people who are having trouble raising their hands, and I believe the way you do it is go into participants. Is that correct? And then there should be a raised hand archive, icon rather, archive. We do have an archive of raised hands right now, and leading them off is Lynn Farrington.
Hi, thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful. You got me thinking about the whole issue that we've talked about here at Penn sometimes of updating metadata, because I think that, you know, metadata can be created, but sometimes we realize the metadata doesn't do a good job of actually describing the things, or it introduces issues into it. So things that, you know, updating metadata, adding local notes when we know more about something, as with this particular image and other things within a larger collection. So thinking about that whole role of, you know, metadata plays a role, but to some extent it can also misdirect us. And how do we look at updating it to redirect us in the ways that we want to, you know, perceive it towards the future? So rethinking that whole issue. Metadata isn't fixed. It doesn't have to stay exactly the same forever. It can be updated. I realize it's an issue of time and energy, but sometimes it may be important to do so. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn. Thank you very much.
Sarah Horowitz.
Hi. Thanks for this really fascinating and interesting talk. I want to ask something that I think sort of builds on what Catherine and Lynn were getting at, which is the issue of labor in archives, right? Like the fact that archives don't just sort of grow from the ground up, but that what is included in archives is decided by people, and the description is added by people, and so that there's a sort of labor mechanism that is part of that, and all of those people of course bring their biases and their backgrounds to that work. And so I'm wondering what role the issue of labor might play in your conception of decolonizing the archives, and how those pieces might work together.
So this is so helpful. So I should mention that I'm not an archivist, many of you are. And I think at the beginning of the talk, I used the phrase, you know, I sort of would dash into an archive. I mean, I spent, you know, 7 years, I did my time, right? Of summer after summer and a long stretch in India. Trust me, I've done this. But I mean, you know, I was looking at the archive as a user, as a consumer, right? Not as somebody who was producing them. And what I kept finding when I was working in the 19th century, both at the colonial archives held in London and then the little regional archives around the UK and then the archives in India, was that they're almost always misleading. So I think Catherine and Lynn are absolutely right. One puts in stuff, it's a container and it's efficiency. But then I also began to realize that these archives often tell stories where the informant, the person about whose stories were being told, so here your labor question is really helpful, were actually inserting different stories. So in the 19th century colonial archives in India, we saw Indian scribes whose job it was to write the archival notes, putting in completely irrelevant, apparently irrelevant stories. I mean, in some ways I could make a claim that this was the subaltern speaking loud and clear to somebody else that they wanted to get to. So that's one account of labor. The other account of labor, and here again, I want to come back to the fact that I'm not an archivist, but I'm a user of archives, is we can and should partner with the archivists, but also take that object and do different things with it than might have been intended. Right? That's what decolonization is. That's what reading an object differently involves. And that's what I'd like to invite people to do. That if there's a gap, I mean, it's really important to speak about that gap and to find other ways to fill it in. So if there are 109 boxes of one person and there's 4 drawings of another, maybe we could talk about that. And I think that work of intellectual labor is the labor I'm invoking when I call decolonizing archives.
Okay. I have a question from Remy Mize. in the chat. Thank you so much for this talk. I'm sorry I can't turn my video on at the moment, but I'm wondering if you can speak to how you understand the decolonizing of an archive in relation to the base root of the decolonization mandate, which is fundamentally land repatriation, rematriation to sovereign indigenous nations. I'm thinking of Tuck and Yang's essay, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor.
Right. I don't have an answer for that, Remy. I'm so sorry. I just don't, right? I just don't know where to start there, but I'd love to read more about it.
Okay. Peter Stalybras.
Thank you. Oh, I turned on. Yeah. Thank you so much, Priya. That was really wonderful. Am I turned on?
Yes, you are.
Yeah. Okay. Good. That was really fabulous. I really want to sort of build on what Catherine was asking, and Sarah as well, which is thinking about the very thing that you were so generous about. You were very generous in the way you talked about the archives, you know, and I think that one of the things that really strikes me about archives is the financial hierarchies of them. That the actual way in which catalogers work is normally under very specific time and money constraints, which varies enormously depending upon the specific archive. So that, you know, Penn gets thrown money to do one archive, for instance, like in Cunables, we got a lot of money for cataloging, and they are beautifully cataloged. So I think one of the things when one thinks about decolonizing may actually be thinking also about how one thinks about hierarchies of where the money goes to do thick cataloging or rich cataloging. One example of that strikes me, there's an incredible document of a cholera camp in India, which is written, as far as I can see, on lavatory paper. It's an amazing racist and misogynist document written by an English army officer with drawings, and I mean it's violently misogynist against white women as well as violently racist. It's an extraordinary document, but it seems to be written on lavatory paper, which may be partly because he was in cholera camp, so it also raises questions of access of a person like that. But coming back to the question of cataloging, it seems to me that one of the things that's really important is that catalogers, by and large, are like people who turn over the pages in music. In other words, you can only get it wrong. Do you know what I mean by that? In other words, if you're turning over the pages in music, you don't notice the person, you're not meant to notice it, unless they actually don't turn the page rightly. So catalogers tend to be underpaid in my experience, you know, and so they tend to be at the bottom of very low in library hierarchies, apart from perhaps a few catalogers. And that part of the problem is that decolonization also requires us as academics to work more closely and to give a more rich feedback, the very things in a way that Sarah, I think, and Catherine were talking about, a sort of rich feedback in which the very work that you're doing, that's what needs to happen, is for that to get back at some level into the actual cataloging. Because if you don't catalog things at all, which the Library of Congress massively is under cataloged. I mean, there are whole massive archives that have no cataloging whatsoever, and it means that you don't know they're there. They're completely invisible. The whole world doesn't know they're there. So you can't even begin when you've got something like that to do the work. So in that sense, cataloging is the most important thing of all. It's the first point that you need a library. At the same time, it's the most undervalued in many ways. And so I think one of the things to keep remembering is to how we bring back in that connection of the labor that different people do and making sure all of it's valued.
Peter, thanks. That's right. So it's interesting how giving a talk to book historians in a library setting, or where we would have been meeting in a library had we had sort of our real life back, we'd be meeting at the GISLAC. It's become a talk about cataloging, but remember, I mean, I'm not a librarian and I'm not an archivist. I use these places and I'm interested in covering the histories that these spaces are pointers to, or repositories of, right? So Peter's absolutely right that these cataloging is an incomplete space. I mean, we all have anecdotes about libraries we've gone to where we stumbled on something that had never been cataloged and we felt, aha, and we found stuff. I mean, Jean-Christophe Cloutier is right here. JC's got awesome stories about stuff he just discovered, right? But if we made this about, oh, somebody at Columbia was an idiot and didn't know how to catalog, that would be a completely, it would be a dog bites man story. The man bite dog story is JC's story, which is, aha, nobody cataloged this. I'm not going to focus on the idiocy of that person who missed it. I'm actually going to focus on the history of African-American writing, which became your prize-winning book, JC, right? And I think I'm more interested in what one does with the incompletions, the gaps, and so on and so forth, recognizing that there are discoveries to be made. But also, and here's another great book this is like a first book bonanza right here. The other great book, of course, is Derek Spires' book, where the history that Derek is tracking is not a history that is available necessarily in the archives we'd normally turn to. So you may not find it at the Library of Congress, and you may not find it in that degree at the Schomburg. And this is where Derek's work then went to completely different archives, made them what they are, and made us rethink what Black citizenship looked like in the 19th century and why that matters. So here again, I'm going to question, I no disrespect to my friends who are archivists, many of you are here, your labor is really important, but at the end of the day, it's what happens to those archives, and that interpretive work needs to happen. We'll partner with you, but to me and my students and my colleagues, this is what I would say is really the urgency of decolonizing. I hope that answers it. It's not a disrespect at all to the work. It's rather the opportunity that the archive opens up that I'm hoping this talk is about. Because if we make it about the archivist, it becomes about the Beinecke and it becomes about Yale. But what happens to the Kiowa warriors and a group that has been dispossessed, et cetera, et cetera? I'd like us to just begin to equalize or bring a different history to light, right?
And speaking of Derek Spires, he seems to have a hand raised. Derek?
Yeah, hello. Thanks for the talk and the provocations and this conversation that is generated. And I think my question kind of dovetails with this discussion of the relation between archives, archivists, and scholarship. Some of the people I draw on are folks like Dorothy Porter, who were sort of both archivists and their archiving work was scholarship itself. And I'm also shifting the conversation a little bit selfishly because I'm mapping out my courses for the spring and teaching a grad seminar in print culture. And I'm stuck on like you've outlined the where we stand, the when we stand, and how we stand. And I'm trying to think and rethink again and again how to, again, a classroom setting in conversation, shift the how we stand, which I think is in some instances, like this conversation around archives and catalogs suggests, shaped by the when and how, right? In the sense that how we stand is shaped by like when we encounter a catalog and at what stage that cataloging is. But it's also shaped by perspective. So I'm trying to think through how to like responsibly in a classroom and mentoring students shape the how. Like it's something that's kind of ineffable. On the one hand, the how gets shaped by experience, but it's also something I like to kind of, jumpstart.
Right. I think you're asking, Derek, the $1 million question, like, how do we train people to do this work? I mean, I don't know that I would have started, I couldn't imagine, and maybe some of you have different views, but this being a dissertation, this kind of question that I asked, right? It's come about from 25 years of grunt work in archives and work that I really enjoyed. And then really it's come about out of a sense of, as I mentioned, rage and fury, and some sense that I had to connect the scholarly part of my life with the kind of public world in which I live in, a world which is on unceded land of people known as the Lenape, right? I mean, there's some way in which those two connections had to come in. So how do you teach that? I don't know. I don't know that you can. I think that one way to do it is to train our students to ask better questions, right? Just ask a really good question. So my whole experience with archives 25 years ago started because I asked a question that I thought I had the answer to, and my supervisor, who's not a book historian, although he's done a ton of work in book history, Franco Moretti, said, oh, well, could you provide some evidence for that? And boom, 5 years later, a dissertation was born. So I think sometimes just asking a question pops you in some place. So this may sound like complete anathema to those of you who train students more systematically. I'm thinking about Peter, for example. the rest of us, you know, we kind of bumble around, we find stuff, we see stuff, we have a kind of intellectual history, we see what pops in. And I'm not sure that answers your question, but we've talked about this in other contexts, most recently at that Harvard seminar on new directions in Black book history. Like, how do you teach this stuff? I think you just tell your students to read as much as they can and jump into an archive and see what they find. But that's a really clumsy way. That's what I call archival takeout. But maybe Kinoe and others have an answer to that.
Yeah, Kanoe Nishikawa.
Thank you, Priya. I certainly don't have an answer, but I'd like to follow up on what Derek asked by really inviting you to draw those connections between the work of this Kiowa artist and the sort of racial strife that we've all experienced, and that the killing of George Floyd sort of brought into terrible focus. It struck me in looking at this illustration that one point of connection between Black and Indigenous studies in a common effort to decolonize archives has to do with histories of mass incarceration. And that, perversely or not, what we have here is a document that the artist was forced to create, but that nonetheless tells a story of Native incarceration that, as I will put in the chat here, links quite poignantly, but also problematically, to histories of Black men who actually, in fact, make art in prisons. And Nicole Fleetwood's recent book, Marking Time, is a wonderful history and ethnography of Black men who are creating art despite these horrible circumstances. And the key here, which is going to take us away from the cataloging question to your point about what do we do with these objects when we have them, is there a way of reading this illustration and acknowledging the conditions under which it was created, but also taking the artist seriously as an artist, and not to sort of dismiss it as, well, it was created under awful conditions, but to do the work that Nicole Fleetwood does, which is to say these Black men are locked up, and I'm going to go in there and to take their art seriously and to see indeed what kind of art is produced under these conditions. So I just want to invite you to reflect on that, because as an African-Americanist, I certainly see Native and Black connections in histories of mass incarceration. And these histories, until recently, these are histories that haven't really been emphasized or told. So thank you for framing it in a way that helped me make that connection. This gets to Derek's point of how to do this work.
Right. That's really helpful, Kanoe. So this notion of taking the art seriously as art is important. And if there were art historians here, they would do that work for us, right? And it's just not my training, not in any formal way, right? So what else can we do? If we're not an art historian and we've got this archive of art, incarcerated art, let's say, and in Doanmoe's case, he wasn't quite incarcerated. He went in, he worked at 3 years at this, at Fort Marion, and then he sort of went and taught for a while at the Carlisle School. So yes, what do we do with this art? And is reading it as an art object the only way to read it? And that's where I would demur a bit, right? I would actually begin to think that there's much work to be done. This could be a speech act where the visual drawing or the drawing with color pencil is the only form of utterance available. Like, why is it that it's Pratt's writing on top, right? The Pratt writing the caption and he writing the drawing. Did Pratt dictate the drawing? Is there some kind of subaltern speak happening here? Is it that he was not allowed to write or didn't know how to write? I'd be curious. So in some ways, to talk about it only as a drawing, I mean, I think that that work should be done, and I think art historians should do it. I'd sort of be interested in the broader sociology that this object and this series of objects and this archive of drawings speaks to us for. Because of course, we also have a fairly substantial archive of incarcerated writing, Black American writing coming out of prisons that's textual, right? The broad point I'd like to invite is that that archive of production has to be reckoned with and read, not just as how does this measure up to, you know, gosh, my memory of American scholars is so weak these days, but how does this measure up to the work of, oh, Philip Roth? Well, it doesn't, because it's not Philip Roth, it's somebody else, or Updike, right? It's a different history, it's a different sociology. And so to talk about it in literary terms means we need different instruments of analysis that our typical literary training may not give us. And we have to be open to that work. So I don't know if that answers you, but I think it opens up a conversation that we should have over drinks or something sometime. Right.
Ellen Garvey.
This was a really interesting talk. And I wanted to focus a bit on the whole question of the ledger and the art as well. We, you know, there's a lot of reuse of ledgers in other kinds of well, of course, in this, there's a long tradition in Native American art, but there's also scrapbooks that are also in conversation. The ledger, on the underlying ledger is, or the whatever the underlying text is in some sense in conversation with what's pasted over it. And I'm very struck by the way, I mean, that you're enlarging and calling out the content of the figures inside the trains or whatever those horse-drawn cars are. Also, when you back up, however, you realize that there's a great attention to counting everybody, and that the artist in some way is making an accounting as much as he's making a drawing. Again, an earlier, you know, many other Native American writing traditions that call on that. And I think I saw Germaine had her hand up, so maybe she's going to speak about that. But I also wonder then, that raises the question of coercion and dictation. How much is this Richard Pratt saying, show my power, count everybody? And how much is it the artist saying, I want to make a record of every person, even if I can only do it with a small pen stroke or pencil stroke? It also raises the question of the difference between the buffalo skin and the ledger, not just in terms of scale and, you know, the texture, but also the spaciousness of that one image that you showed that went by very briefly, and I'm sorry I didn't get to look more closely, that is not concerned with counting. It's concerned, but this is, and I wonder if you might want to comment more on the content. I mean, this is different from the really fascinating discussion that's been going on about archival issues, but I wonder if you might comment on that use of the ledger and the counting that's going on in this picture, the earlier picture.
So Ellen, is this the image that's up on screen right now that you were referencing? I think
that was the one you showed earlier. Was that on a buffalo skin, or was that on something?
No, that's also ledger art.
I see.
And this is a different acquisition at the Beinecke. This was 2009. And it was, you can see at the very top here, this is a typed caption. So this was probably made for those kind of commercial ventures that Pratt involved himself in. It's also made by Doanmoe. And there's a series of artists, but this is also a Doanmoe drawing. But this was then sold, and to make it, I guess, official or make it look nice, Pratt had somebody type up the text on top. So this is the one. And then the other one that we know, and this is the one that I've been talking about, where, and you're absolutely right, it's counting, it's enumerating, and so on and so forth. Yeah. And by the way, this notion of counting, if you look at the Hyde images or the Hyde art, which is extraordinary, and it's so radiant, but it's so, it's difficult to read for 21st century or even 20th century readers, because we don't know the terms of the pictograph, right? This is narrative art. This is the stuff that Pratt taught and insisted that Native artists learn from him because he felt that this was Western perspective. And so I always put Western in quote marks because it's unclear who's West. But this then is the art that Pratt inspired, right? And incidentally, again, I'm moving so far outside my area of expertise, but if you look at some of the settlements, well, I'll stop. But I mean, if you look at some of the settlements that were made along the way, they are very similar to these very little kind of what I call Lego houses that you'll see. I mean, it's really, it's an art that actually the landscape seems to speak to. But anyway, I'll stop because, you know. Jermaine?
I was muted, sorry.
Yeah,
Jermaine.
sorry.
I have to unmute myself. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. All right, fine. I have to take a completely different pathway. I couldn't agree more about the need to decolonize these things. I'm not sure that we would agree on the route to doing it. There are masses of pictures that came out of Fort Marion. And historically, Pratt has been regarded as, in some places, a good guy, in some places, a bad guy. I don't want to argue his case here now. What I would like to point out is that it's actually something you were implying was needed in what you just said last time, or maybe the time before. And that is, we need to go and look at the indigenous tradition of inscription to understand what's really going on here. There isn't a thing that surprises me about either of these pictures. If you look at not just Fort Marion, but you sometimes look at modern things like Bonnie Devine's stuff, or you go back to ledger books, buffalo robes, painted shirts, and although there's a gap in the historical record because they began using materials that decayed and weren't saved, go back right to petroglyphs. The business of counting is always there. You count coup against an enemy because it's much more important. It isn't even often the case of killing the enemy. You touch him, and it's a much more prestigious thing to do, to touch your enemy, than to kill him. You count the days in the graphic calendars that were made by Native people in the 19th century. You count all the time. And it's something that a lot of people were interested in. And of course, it's an ancient tradition in many cultures. The tally goes way, way back. I'm just saying, what I really want to say as quickly as possible is that to unlock these things, we need to step outside our own immediate concerns, which are genuine ones. I share them, and say, what the hell is going on in this inscription? I refuse to call it either letters or paintings, because I think it's a very confused area when you're looking at the tradition that, even the word tradition is wrong. I have been criticized for using that. The history of practices that runs from the very ancient petroglyphs right to the present day. I can point to you an artifact in Alberta, a big cliff that I've just recently written on. I can point to you an artist in Ontario who's using exactly the same graphic materials to make very important art today. What we need to do is understand the history of those practices. And then, and only then, will we really understand whether the pictures of those wagons are in some sense, do they come out of the vocabulary that the artist acquired as a Kiowa? And the spatial arrangement, again, does that come out of the vocabulary that the artist comes equipped with? We need to know that before we assume that in some sense he was compelled to do that.
Thanks, Jermaine. And I noticed that John just put a citation on the chat, so I'll be happy to look that up. And I really appreciate the comment. Citation to second something you'd said.
I've got
Thank
something
you.
more coming up too. So thanks to Glenda, who's also in this talk.
And D. Andrews.
Okay, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear
Yes.
me? Actually, I'm going to plug something in. This is a little beyond my ken, truly. I just was, and I really, because it strikes me, that I mean, along the lines of what's good about it is you just never know what you're going to find. And I think Priya would totally agree with this. You just never know. And sometimes you don't know what you're looking at and you have to put it aside. And I've had a couple of experiences like that with archives with some African materials in them and so forth. And I just can't read them. And I think I would make a distinction in the decolonizing concept between the reading, the great triad that Priya presented, and the work of the archives themselves, which is what Peter was talking about, and Sarah. It's because I thought that initially what you were going to talk about was how do librarians bring in other kinds of collections. How do you do this? And how do you encourage people who are generally not considered collectors or donors to consider their papers, their family lives, their histories to be important? And this is going on across the country. In my own state university, our department is doing a lot of oral history, for example, with students, a lot of outreach to communities, to have involvement with I teach in the Bay Area in California, to have involvement with the larger community in historical consciousness, which hopefully will result in greater expansion for archives. And I've noticed, for example, the Maryland Historical Society put out a call for material from this summer's activism. Please send us what you know, photographs, accounts, recordings of what your experience has been this summer in the Black Lives Matter protests. And so I think there's sort of two different things going on here that are not mutually exclusive, that in fact are necessarily linked, which is how we, I'm an historian, and scholars read materials and what we're looking for, and being very aware, as Priya so beautifully says, of what is missing. What's missing here? What did not make it into my, I work in the 18th century. Almost everything didn't make it into the archives that we're trying to understand. I mean, I'm exaggerating terribly, but what is it we don't know in history? And it's almost, we know a little edge of things. We know a modicum of what actually happened, created by a literate elite of some kind, or church history, or other sources. And same thing applies to art, of course. I think graphic imagery is becoming so important now because it's an important mode of teaching. Do I recall correctly that Patrick said he had his students actually create albums in his classes so that they can know what it meant to work in that kind of material, to actually get their hands dirty with it. So all these things, the teaching and the scholarship and the creation of archives, they all work together. And I would say you might just want to expand on what decolonization means. It means it's a big deal. And it means a kind of collaborative effort by scholars, librarians, professors, teachers, high school teachers, oral history collectors, family history lovers, genealogists, to, Black history and genealogy is huge these days, to create something that is far more inclusive and embracing. And to me, that's the big definition of decolonizing. I say that with hesitation because I have not thought a lot about this, but as you were talking and other people were talking, I thought this is such a major subject. And it's not just for scholars, it's not just a matter of interpretation, it's a matter of, you know, the actual enrichment of the collections we use through education, funding, all kinds of, well, you know, dare I say it, material issues. I'll stop at that.
No, Dee, this is really terrific to hear. I mean, I also really appreciate your making the connection, making explicit the connection between the act of interpreting an archive and the act of producing an archive. And it's helpful for you to have you spell out that archives are not fixed and stable, that they're not just big institutions that produce them, Beinecke or Penn, which John is standing up for in his thriving chat, but also the kind of work that, you know, communities do, right? So yeah, no, absolutely, that's really, really helpful. And, you know, at some point, those micro archives or those less central archives, many of you have worked and published on them, will begin to uncover and create narrative strands that are palpable and more resonant, right? And essentially, I mean, I was really, as I mentioned when I started this paper, this was a product of rage. Like, how can this happen? How can we be so ignorant of our own history? How can I be so ignorant of this history? And I think this paper is a part to think about some of these bigger issues and not to kind of fall into that archival silo of, oops, I said something terrible about X archive or Y, but rather in our practices, what can we do to come up with a different future? So reading the past differently, reading the present differently might be one way to do that.
Can I just give two quick shout outs, a quick tag onto this. Jen Garcon, who's going to speak to us next semester, is a library colleague who is actually, as one of her charges, working on community archiving. So I think a number of libraries, to follow up on what Dee is saying, are thinking seriously and in new ways about this. And then on the teaching side, you're right, Dee, and it's a good point. And, you know, our colleague here, Holly Mengel, has taught with JC and actually sort of tried to make the process of archival description part of a classroom pedagogy. If it's a kind of deconstruction, if you want to use that word, but, you know, the sort of the process of sorting, description, describing, collecting, naming, to, you know, demystify, to problematize, to make it part of our pedagogy. I think these are interesting frontiers for all of us, even at, and not just at big institutions. They can be part of a lot of different places and pedagogies. Thanks, sorry.
I'm not, oh, I do. Hamid has a question, okay.
Hi, Priya. This was really a great talk. And I think this conversation is amazing, very thought-provoking. What I have to say is a little bit more of an observation than question, but it's kind of like touching what John just mentioned in terms of pedagogy and demystifying archive. I think it's like you do a brilliant job talking about when, where, how, and kind of why archive and being aware of one's agenda and prospect when you are in archives, in awareness of having decolonization as a kind of like an aim and scope. But what is missing, I think, in our discussion, and I would like to hear what you have to say, is the embodiment involved in archival work, be it scholars or archivists or student. It's an embodied practice, and who is doing what. And in that sense, I would like to think about the accessibility to archives and the privilege of certain people accessing certain archives while others cannot. And I mean, I personally had huge difficulty sometimes accessing queer archives in Istanbul. And you know, I would be blocked certain way not to reach at this early modern kind of representation. Some of them would come as scandalous. Or recently, anyone who has conversation with a Black scholar, Black historian, will know what they face in archives and libraries and in terms of their access to the spaces. So I heard you repeating again and again. I mean, it's great. I respect archive as a kind of literary historian, and respecting archive is okay. But I would like to hear, isn't it okay to disrespect archive? Yeah. Can we demystify archive? Unless, if we are aiming to decolonize archive, then your argument is it's a colonial space and practice if we are decolonizing it. In that sense, do we have to respect something as long as they are not decolonized? And if we think they are not accessible to everyone, and if the site itself has this colonial practices within itself that really goes unremarkable, then can we just simply demystify it and disrespect archive and find new ways of archiving? So I would love to hear what you had to say.
Wow, that's great. That's so fantastic. Thank you for getting this. So I think embedded in your question, so forgive me if I'm overreading it or misreading it, correct me immediately, is that some of the archives we find ourselves turning to, those who can, and I recognize 100% the privilege of getting to an archive and the cost of that, right? So we'll talk about that next, but my understanding, I think I understand you saying, look, so much of the archives that we go to first are the better organized or the more central or the whatever, and they tend to be archives exactly embodying or having these colonial spoils, the colonial archives with the, spoils of war, right? So,
but also in terms of accessibility, I'm thinking about Black students arrested in libraries, Black scholars being watched in when they are in certain archives and having eyes on them. I'm like that accessibility, that privilege of embodied subject as well.
Yeah. So that's one, right? And I guess relatedly, the second one is, what if the archive is not legible to the mainstream? So this past summer, I was reading a bunch of first books, and there was an extraordinary first book, which seemed to me to really kind of turn a corner on literary history and turn a corner on the practices of literary history. I mean, it seemed to me so obviously an enormous contribution to, the thing that the discipline of literary studies does. And quite a few of the people on this committee that I was reading these books with said, yeah, but this is oral history, this does not count. Right? So then there's another form in which certain archives, print, textual, XYZ count, and archives of peoples who don't have access to that don't count. So I think that's a really great question. I don't know that I have an answer to it that's going to be taken particularly seriously, but I will propose it here anyway, that there are times when archives don't come to us and we can't get to them. I think it's okay. And again, I'm going to have a huge recoil, so I'm ready for it, but please tell me that I'm wrong. I think we make up archives, right? I mean, I don't think there is this fetish, this central touchstone that we all have to show up in. I think that there are practices we can do where we make up the stuff we get to, and we work with those fragments because those are the only ones available to us, right? I mean, a really silly example that I think everybody in this room has probably read about. Oh, there was Ernst, there's this figure who is kind of lost in Istanbul, since you mentioned Istanbul, with a library of 40 books. And based on that library, they're going to write a literary history of European realism, right? I mean, that all sounds wonderful. And we've taken that work very seriously. And mimesis has become this kind of touchstone of European realist thought. But I'm just curious, well, actually, it's not. It's an incomplete reading, but it was the only reading that Auerbach had when he wrote the work in 1940 or 42 or whatever it was, right? And I'm just curious, we allowed that incomplete archive to stand, but other incomplete archives are looked down upon. And I would like us to decolonize our own perspectives when we look at archives. So I agree, I was super privileged to go off and look at these archives, and I was able to extract, oodles of cash from various institutions to do this work. But I think when we don't have archives, we work with what we have, and we do that responsibly. I don't know how to teach that. I can just say that that's got to be our mantra. Hamid, I hope that begins the conversation, but I hope we can have more of that, because this is a really great,
Thank you, Priya. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, archivists beware.
Yeah, archivists, tell me I'm wrong when I tell you we can make up stuff. I mean, Jerry, look at the work you do as a publisher, right? I mean, you've got this amazing Penn archive, and at some point, somebody's going to want to poke around and want to know what it is. I assume that Penn will be pretty good, Penn Press will be pretty good, and say, yeah, sure, take a look at our publishing records. But for many of us who worked in publishing archives, nobody thought that that was a record we wanted to expose or open up. And what was exposed and opened up was so selective across the years, right? So I think part of what I'm proposing is that archives themselves are mutable.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, airing Penn Press's dirty laundry. I mean, we weed out files with great energy. I mean, this is the age of paper files, of course, and now, I mean, everything has gone digital. It's a whole different set of questions we don't know the answers to. But no, there was one unfortunate summer when on, I think, their first days working at the press, the summer interns were told to clean the files, and basically file folders were emptied. So don't look to us for too much in the archive. That will be an imaginary archive that needs to be recreated. But well, and yes, I mean, the question of what our digital archives will be, of course, something I guess all of us are thinking about, and questions for other days. And meanwhile, the questions that you raised for us today were, I think, as is evidenced from the question and answer period, extraordinarily productive and thought-provoking for us. And I really thank you for bringing our semester to such a strong and wonderful close. And I thank everybody who has joined us this semester. It really has been heartening to see the size of our community and see where you're all coming from. And it's been one of the very few upsides to what we've all been living through. So thank you all for giving us that boost.
Thank you all very much. This was so helpful. I'm so grateful to all of you. Thank you.
Okay. Good night, and we'll see you all in January.